Well, I'm really excited to be here talking about this book. I myself, and I think you all are probably in the same situation as me. Before I read this book, we sort of hear buzz about the birth rate, usually from fascist parties in Europe, or sort of center-right commentators like Ross Douthat from the New York Times, and we sort of it kind of all floats by, and we don't really engage it, even though as the female 99%, it's really our bodies and shortcomings that are under discussion, right? But often it has seemed that the feminist movement hasn't really known what to think of it. So I'm really politically excited about this book, but it's also important to acknowledge that it's a big analytic accomplishment also to have a feminist interpretation of this issue that we have just sort of been letting them discuss for so long. And I'm really excited about that. So I want to jump right in. I mean, we're always fighting for our reproductive rights, right? I mean, we're always fighting to defend abortion, trying to expand access to birth control. Like, we're just, we've been fighting for this all of our adult lives, and before that, people were still doing that. But why is this always a fight? Actually, no, don't answer that yet. But I mean, what are some of the assumptions that feminists have generally made about why this is a fight? What stories have feminists told about the ruling class interest in our reproduction?
Well, in the
standard stories.
Toward the end of the 19th century, the feminists basically thought that the reason that birth control and abortion had been outlawed was the cannon fodder argument that they wanted more troops, that they wanted women to produce. And this was very explicit. Both Teddy Roosevelt was raging against women who didn't have kids, and feminists were saying that the reason that they want us to have so many kids is to supply this incipient empire that the U.S. was becoming at that point. So I think that is very different from what we think of maybe in the 60s, where what we were hearing, at least from a portion of the establishment, was that women were having too many babies. It was causing all this crime and overcrowding in the cities, and women were once again to blame. And so it was hard for feminists.
Placing demands on the welfare system.
Yeah. So feminists. Now, some feminists still thought there was a reason that the ruling class wanted the birth rate up, but many feminists, and I can count among these maybe Linda Gordon, who wrote a history of birth control, even some of the pioneers in the abortion movement, like Lucinda Sisler. They thought, yeah, there is an overpopulation problem. The U.S. ruling class isn't doing anything to help with that, but they're not cutting back on abortion and birth control because of population, because they want more population. They're cutting back on it for these other reasons. And they had several other reasons that they gave, basically wanting the church to grow, or having religious objections, punishing women for having sex was a big one.
That's sort of a standard one.
Yeah, and this has sort of been the story up through 2000 or so, and this is also the story that Thomas Frank in his book What's the Matter with Kansas tells, which is, abortion and birth control are not really issues that the ruling class cares about directly, but they're using it as a way to wedge working class Catholics away from the Democratic Party. They want to excite an evangelical base. He even says, well, they don't want to outlaw abortion because if they outlaw abortion, that will lose them one of their issues that they can sort of get votes with. So it's very much a political football. It's not really an issue about how many people are produced. So that's, I think, and I think that's where we stood in the early 2000s when we first started working on this project.
But these, you find these narratives are not quite right.
Yeah, I mean, our experience started. Now, Kathy Sarachild, who is here and is with Red Stockings, I should say, Red Stockings in its 50th year, was co-author with me of a book, Red Stockings book, that we wrote about trying to get a national health care system. And in that, she basically said, it looks like women in the U.S. are on a strike. And at the time, it sounded right, but then we weren't sure. So we were in the middle of trying to get the morning after pill over the counter. Oh, dozens of countries already had this when we started. And so we expected the Bush administration to be a big opponent, and they were a big obstacle. What we didn't expect is that there was a 10-year struggle, but as the Obama administration came in, the Obama administration was also opposed to getting morning after pill contraception over the counter. In fact, they overrode the FDA's order to put it over the counter for all ages. So we were we were a little bit shocked. I mean, we sort of, the Democratic Party hadn't been all we wanted on reproductive rights, but here we were talking about contraception. Obama explicitly said he didn't want his young daughters to get a hold of this pill, which was sort of contradictory. And so we started to look at why opposition to birth control had become mainstream, because with abortion, at least you can say, well, okay, maybe this political argument is right, but 80% of anti-abortion people are for birth control. So you're really taking a position that's wildly at odds with your constituents if you're opposing birth control. So we began to wonder if maybe there was something going on, and if it was maybe a period more like the 1913 than maybe 2013, right? In terms of what was going on with population politics.
So, in other words, you began to think the ruling class wants us to make babies.
Yeah, I mean, and then at the same time, we had this experience in our group of wanting to have kids and not being able to make it work. So we had a consciousness raising in 2015 where we went around the room, and many people had already had one child, wanted a second, felt that their family was not complete, remembered, had great relationships with their siblings, just felt that their family was not complete with one, but could not make it work based on the double day that they were working, the expense of childcare, unreliable health care, not having paid leave, all of the things that we know that sort of go into making it possible to have kids. And then those of us who hadn't had kids often also had similar reasons. It was certainly true for me. I went for 15 years without any health insurance at all, and then when I got a policy, it ruled out anything that was a pre-existing condition, including my reproductive organs, and it required that if I did get pregnant, I had to have in advance already bought a pregnancy rider in order to cover the pregnancy. I mean, it was just, and you start to think, if I can't even get health care, am I really going to be able to cover this child? I was not living a very well-paid life. It definitely was a factor. It was definitely a factor. And we found that it was universally a factor for women in our group who wanted kids. Now, of course, there were some who never wanted kids. They wanted to do other things. That's fine. But for those who did want kids, it was really becoming an obstacle.
So that started to make up the texture of how you understood our reproductive working conditions.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, and then what Red Stockings calls the myth of America, right? Where we think we've got it so great in this country. If you start looking at what other countries have in terms of reproductive work, such as paid parental leave, where they're essentially paying you to have a kid, right? You're off your job, you're getting a paycheck, but you're, right? The U.S. is doing it entirely on the cheap, and, you know, you get 16 months in Sweden, you get almost 2 years in France. Here, apparently, employers could not possibly even tolerate 8 weeks of paid leave. We've had to struggle for that and got in a couple of states, and then it's a very small portion of your salary. Childcare, just the expense of childcare is borne by the families in the U.S., whereas it's largely borne by the state in many countries in Europe, and really a lot of countries, not just the developed countries. And then, I mean, we're the only country really that has no paid parental leave. So the comparison becomes very stark. Also, all these countries have national health care systems, so you have guaranteed health care. They also, many of them have child allowances, basically a check you get for every kid you have. Once we started looking at that, it was clear that the U.S.'s strategy was to do it on the cheap and push it all into the family and push all of this work. Yeah.
One of the things that's so intriguing about the story you tell in your book is how differently the U.S. seems to be dealing with the challenge of low or stable birth rates than other countries. I mean, some of the benefits that you just described seem to, in other countries, to have been instituted in part in response to elite concerns about the birth rate, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and whereas our solution seems to be forced childbearing.
Right. So for example, in Sweden in the 30s, there was a lot of concern about women going out to work and the birth rate going down. Into that's basically the origin of the social welfare state in Sweden. In France, there has constantly been worry about the low birth rate because they are competing with Germany, which they were for many centuries constantly at war with. So we have to have more babies, and there's even a cartoon from the 1880s of 3 Germans against 2 French with bayonets drawn, we have to have more kids. So there's been constant pronatalism in France. I mean, France has tried everything, and finally they tried, let's make it easier for women to have kids by instituting long paid leaves, lots of childcare, and they've really put a lot of resources into it. But before that, they were doing the same thing that we're doing here, which was trying to make it harder to get birth control, making abortion illegal, bad sex education, all of the things that we're seeing here. But in the U.S., we're still in that situation of this coercive pronatalism, essentially, making it harder and harder to get abortions, making it harder and harder to get birth control, sex education that doesn't explain sex, all of the things that we know that are going on.
Yeah. So I want to. So a couple times in this discussion already, the concept of consciousness raising has come up, and I wonder if you could explain a little bit what that is and where it came from for people who don't know, and how has it been important in the process of creating this book?
So consciousness raising was the program of the 1960s women's liberation movement. It was originated, again, Kathy gets a lot of the credit, and there are other Red Stockings here who, for basically examining our lives as data and then drawing conclusions from it. Basically, rather than studying books about what books say about who women are and what we are, talking among ourselves and each other, and really examining our experiences in an honest and deep way, and then making a conclusion: what is going on? Why are we experiencing these things in our lives? So that was consciousness raising, and it spread the movement like wildfire. It's responsible for really spreading women's liberation across the country by 1970. And we in our groups, so I'm in National Women's Liberation and also Red Stockings, which are both Red Stockings has been almost continuously in operation since it was founding in 1969. But I was also involved in a group called Gainesville Women's Liberation, which was founded in 1968. It was the first Southern Women's Liberation group. And so my group, National Women's Liberation, comes out of those two strains of the women's liberation movement. And we still use consciousness raising pretty much for everything. We use it to figure out our oppression. We use it to figure out organizational strategy, and we use it to figure out organizational issues. I mean, we really sit down and examine our experience in all of those instances, and I think it gives our politics sort of a little bit more grounding in women's experiences and lives. And we have been doing neighborhood consciousness raising in New York, so you don't have to go a long distance. You can just go somewhere that's very close to your house and meet with other women and talk about these issues. And so that's kind of what we've been doing. And there's even a chapter in the book that is essentially consciousness raising testimony about having kids.
Yeah, which is very powerful, and I recommend checking that out. I mean, it's really gives us sense of all the specific things that women experience around having kids or not having kids. I want to come to I think that we among the many assumptions that we as feminists have made about these issues, I think one of them is that we tend to assume that governments want white women to reproduce more and women of color to reproduce less. We tend to assume that it's racist in this very particular way. You agree that there's a lot of racism surrounding the discussion of birth rates and women's reproductive rights, but that it doesn't always play out in quite the way that we assume. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the history of reproductive coercion in this country starts with slavery, right? Black women have always borne the brunt of this. In the slave system first started by claiming that children of an enslaved woman were owned by the owner of that enslaved woman, even if the father was free. So that meant that enslaved women's reproduction was a source of wealth for Southern landowners, not just as workers, but also as wealth in themselves. And so this created enormous pressure for enslaved women to reproduce, and of course they resisted. In fact, it turns out that chewing on cotton root is a fairly effective contraceptive, which they discovered. They also concealed miscarriages, figured out, did all the things that women do when they're trying to control their reproduction. So any forms of abortion and whatnot. But with the end of slavery, and I should say that there was a lot of nervousness on the part of slave owners during that period about the fact that they were in many states outnumbered by the people they were holding captive, right? Mm-hmm. So, and when the Haitian Revolution starts in 1791, they really freak out, and they don't want to import any slaves from the Caribbean because they're afraid that it will bring the flame of insurrection north. So then there's even more pressure on enslaved women to be the reproducers. So this, and it takes all kinds of horrifying forms. when slavery is finally
because they don't want to bring in any of these radical people.
They don't want to, so they ban importation in 1808 partly because of this nervousness about importing slaves from other places where they might have an idea of rebellion, and so that brings even more pressure on black women to produce. But when slavery ends, they still have to keep this workforce in place. And so there's a long period of making laws against vagrancy. You can't leave if you owe money. So anyway, they're trying to keep this black workforce in place, which is no longer in bondage, but is very much, these laws are trying to sort of force them back into bondage. However, repression being what it is in the South, and the economic situation in the South being really miserable for black people, they leave in what's like this enormous migration, the Great Migration. They go south, they go west, they go north, they get on, and there are even stories about Southern landowners trying to prevent them from leaving, tearing up their tickets. So what happens in the 60s, right? Because we hear about forced sterilization as suddenly coming basically in the 60s.
Right.
What happens in the 60s is that there's enormous ferment during World War II around getting black equal rights, and then all these almost 1 million GIs, black GIs, come home, and they're demanding their rights in the South. And Southern landowners get really nervous about this. So what they do is they hurry up the mechanization that starts during World War II when there was a shortage of workers, and they basically, within 15 years, cotton is mechanized in the South. And that means that they have a lot of very militant black workers who are unemployed, and they freak out and they start to really force sterilize. Fannie Lou Hamer, the legendary leader of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, was sterilized in 1961 when she went into the local hospital to get a cyst removed. She estimated that 60% of the women in her county had experienced this when they went to the hospitals. And there's a lot of other evidence of forced sterilization going on. So it's very clear that they wanted black people as long as they could control their work, and then as soon as this population becomes restive, that's when they come in with the forced sterilization. And you can also see that in Puerto Rico. So big U.S. owners come in and take over most of the land in Puerto Rico. Suddenly there's an overpopulation crisis because everybody's been kicked off of the land. And then they come in with both sterilization and the untested birth control pill, which they distribute lavishly, even though they haven't tested it, to make sure that it's safe. So, so I think the dimensions that we can see this on are: is it a land grab? Do they want to grab your land? Is this population costing us money? Like, are they demanding things? Is it in revolt or revolution? And do we need their work? These are sort of the dimensions on which they try to figure out, like, what the population policy is going to be.
Mm-hmm. How about now? Do you think there's a...
Well, it's no irony. I mean, it's very clear, I think, why it's African American women who have been in the forefront of promoting reproductive justice, right? Mm-hmm. The principles of reproductive justice are to be able to not have kids when you don't want kids, to be able to have kids when you do want to have kids, and to have decent conditions in which to raise them. Mm-hmm. So rather than just talking about choice or abortion rights, really talking about the whole range of things. And that comes from this horrifying experience of the forced sterilization being forced on African American women. So, I think the highest consciousness is therefore that's why that Sister Song, Loretta Ross, the group that formed around developing reproductive justice was women of African descent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really important. I also so I think I wonder if you can you talk in your book about a number of times in history where the phrase birth strike has been explicitly used. You know, where can you talk about a few of those? I mean, where like right now we're using it to describe what women may be unconsciously doing, but at certain times the idea of birth strike has been an explicit suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, so Emma Goldman, when she toured around giving her lecture about birth control, called it her birth strike lecture, for example. Very much so that would have been maybe 1913, 1914. It's very much a term used in that period to mean women controlling their reproduction. It doesn't mean necessarily a coordinated, concerted effort, but it basically means we're doing a slowdown because it's so hard. Life is so hard, and there's a wonderful passage in one of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's books. She's an IWW organizer, where she talks about how she walks into the house of a miner. His wife has 8 kids. They're all needing care, and she's completely exhausted from unrelieved childbearing. And Elizabeth Gurley Flynn sort of excoriates the men in the union for not paying attention to how important birth control is. And like when we have a talk about birth control, none of you all show up. Don't you understand how important it is? So there's very clearly an understanding that women are being forced into unrelieved childbearing, and if they had a chance, would be able to stop it. So I think in that sense, it's a slowdown or a strike.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I think is really wonderful about this work is the, we tend as feminists to talk about women's reproduction as a site of oppression. Women are oppressed because we're the ones who biologically can have babies, and this is like used against us in all kinds of ways. Obviously, that's not wrong. But in the book, you wonderfully reframe this, arguing that our reproduction is also a kind of power. I mean, that we have something that they want, and throughout history they've wanted it. I mean, and that society needs this reproductive labor in the same way that it needs, people to keep the factories running, and people to keep the trains and trucks running. So this seems much more exciting and hopeful than, just simply thinking of this as, as a site of like, oh, it's just so terrible, right? So, we control the means of reproduction in the same way that Marx observed that workers in a factory control the means of production. When workers go on strike, they try to get better pay and better working conditions. So what should we try to win in this birth strike?
Well, we've sort of identified 4 big areas, but I think that, we could certainly include more. The big areas are national health care system, guaranteed health care for everyone, paid leave, lots of it, like 16 months that they have in Sweden, for example, childcare, a national childcare system like the public schools with unionized teachers and decent benefits and good, good funding. And again, I think the fight is over our time, so shorter working hours for everybody. And you can see, like in the post-war period, there was this idea that the family wage, the male breadwinner wage, would cover the family. It would cover the breadwinner and his spouse and their children, the spouse always being female. And so that it was a sexist way of arranging things because women were dependent on guys, but it also had a progressive element, which was that the employer was at least putting something in towards the family care job. Well, we don't want to go back to a sexist family wage system, but what we want to do is go forward to what they call the social wage in Europe, which is where these are things that you get just because you're in the country. So national health care is a perfect example of that, right? In the family wage system, the health care is through the job, so you get your health care through your husband's job, right? In a system, so that makes you even more dependent on your spouse, and you're dependent on his employer. In a social wage system, everybody gets health care, married or not. It's not dependent on your marital status at all, and it's not dependent on your relationship to a guy at all. So, so we think that...
I think people don't often realize fully how feminist that is and how impossible women's liberation is without that.
Yeah, right. So for national health care, but also paid leave that doesn't depend. I mean, in some countries in Europe, you don't even have to have a job to get paid leave. You just get it when you have the kid. So just that really replacing some of these things that were done with the family wage with a social wage. But you also notice that the switch as wages dropped and both spouses went out to work, now employers are getting 80 hours where they used to get 40 hours. So, and then the family care job is crammed into the remainder of the day, right? Well, one feminist way to recapture that time is for everybody to work 20 hours for the same pay that they're getting for 40 hours, right? So, if we all had 20-hour weeks, that would substantially recapture some of that time, and it would be essentially where we were back in the 1960s.
So, I think we all know young women and men who say that they're not having children because of the climate crisis. They're really worried that that because of the environmental threats that we're facing, that future generations are going to really have a hard time thriving. Do we think of this as another part of the birth strike, and should addressing climate change and environmental problems be a part of our demands?
I kind of think we should keep them separate, and there are several reasons. One is that when we say we're not having kids because of climate change, it's easily interpreted as that is what we're doing to contribute to not having the climate change. In other words, kids are the problem.
Well, some people do think of it that way.
Yes, and some people, and I have a Facebook page with the name of the book. And people who've been hearing these women in England who say that they're having a birth strike on climate change, I'm getting reactions to that because people are confused and they think it's my Facebook page. And a lot of them are attacking it, but many are going, rah, rah, right, good, let's have less population, that'll solve the climate crisis. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a very tricky question. Now, I should say that we have not called for a birth strike. We're simply reporting that there is one. Now, if we had called for a birth strike about 10 years ago, we would feel that we had been fabulously successful. But
no, it's such a missed opportunity.
But we don't. There are a lot of problems in calling on women to strike, and I'm not sure that they are even calling on women to strike. They may be just reporting that they themselves are striking.
Actually, can I interrupt you in the middle of that? That make your discussion of that and why this isn't where you guys are going with this makes me realize maybe you should explain, as you do in your book, why birth strike is not Malthusian.
Oh, yes. Well,
because there's no way we can get out of this thicket of the environmental discussion without.
Well, we still so Malthus, pastor Robert Thomas Malthus, who's been haunting us for these 300 years, he blamed poverty on the poor because he said people were having too many kids. Mm-hmm. It's a very short version. I go into it in much more detail in the book. But you still hear that a little bit, especially among exponents of birth control, who are saying, "Oh well, if poor people just had more more access to birth control, then there wouldn't be as much poverty." And this is clearly not true. There's a wonderful group of teen parents in Albuquerque who completely debunk this. They point out that they're poor. They would still be poor at 25 if they didn't have kids. It's very hard to become not poor in the U.S. And the kids are not the cause of the poverty. In fact, if you're and specifically they're getting attacked for being teen moms, the kids are clearly not the cause of the poverty because people who don't have kids still stay poor. So who are in their situation. So and instead of but for liberal birth control advocates, this is very much a way to talk about how it's individually our fault for things which in reality are caused by low wages, lack of health care, the carceral state, all of the undercutting of working class life that's been going on in the U.S. for the last 40 years. But they're blaming it on having kids. And since our birth rate is the lowest it's ever been, it's 1.76 kids, it's very unlikely that the increase in poverty is due to our birth rate. It seems like it's just on the face of it obvious that that's not right.
And as you point out in the book, the U.S. has an extremely high poverty rate and for many years had much higher birth rates than countries that don't have very much poverty at all.
So clearly it's more that unions got busted, wages have dropped. These are the reasons that people are poor. But in terms of Malthusianism in the present day, that's what's going on. And it also has this characteristic, and especially in the 60s and 70s during the population bomb scare, of being essentially. And they were very explicit about this. The guy who wrote the original population bomb, not Ehrlich, but this other guy, he says, we can't afford another Vietnam. We have to go in there with birth control. So it's very much part of the imperialist project. Any country that seems to be having revolts, they were very worried that India would have a revolution like China had, and so they went in with sterilizing young men. The whole population control thing. They didn't know what to do about the fact that people were having socialist revolutions and anti-colonial revolutions, but they thought maybe if they reduced the number of people, at least then they would be able to. At least there would be fewer of them. But so this was the establishment's line. Now, for about 40 years, that has no longer really been happening, and people who are exponents of this line, where they're trying to get birth control imposed on countries that are having revolutions or are in danger of having revolutions. This line, those people are complaining that the U.S. government is no longer putting any money into this. Why are they not putting more money into this? So it really hasn't been on the ruling class radar, except in a few cases like the Philippines and Yemen, where the new terrorism is now the new communism, right? So they're very worried about. So you can see that the countries that they concentrate on are ones that have unrest, right? But again, they're trying to solve the maldistribution of goods and the exploitation of people's land and labor. They're trying to solve it by just reducing the number of people, which is obviously not going to solve it.
So it seems like there's a parallel in blaming women's, women having babies in the same way that women having babies used to be the origin problem of poverty. We now see that in many ways women having babies is blamed for the environmental crisis.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so that's sort of.
That was true. That was true in the 60s and 70s too. That was very much like
right,
the
and it's
blame game.
definitely a fairly common line of discourse now. So is that partly why you want to decouple the climate conversation from birth strike?
Yeah, I mean, I think the climate struggle. We need to. We need to take power away from the fossil fuel industry. This is what we need. I don't think our diffuse power as reproducers is going to really have much effect on that. I think we need to be in the streets making that happen.
Yeah, the fossil fuel industry probably doesn't care whether you have another baby.
Yeah, so I do think that they're really separate demands, and they don't line up properly. I mean, I understand that people want to create more urgency around doing something about climate change, and I think the women in England who are saying they're not going to have kids are trying to do that, but there's just I don't think that's a very effective method actually.
But it could be seen as part of the landscape of poor conditions for reproduction, right? I mean, if your air is dirty, your water is dirty.
Yeah, and we have
things don't look good for the future.
It does come up when we do consciousness raising. It does come up. I mean, one person of the 16 testimonies we have in the book mentions it, and it does occasionally come up that people are feeling it's one of like it's not in the top 10. I can tell you that.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. It's and I think everything sort of works together, right? Gosh, I can't afford this. I don't have health care. I don't have the housing that I need. And they're destroying the environment. They're destroying the planet. It's sort of like an additive thing. But I think in isolation, it's not a giant factor at least among women that I've been in CR with about this, which is a lot.
So if people want to join Red Stockings, join National Women's Liberation, find a consciousness-raising group, how should they do that?
Well, did that sign-up sheet go around? Let's make sure the sign-up sheet went around. And we have all contact information here, but the best way is for you to sign up. And we have a Women of Color caucus. If you're a woman of color, please check that. Or you can talk to a member of our Women of Color caucus over here, Allison. Please sign the sheet, and then we have bookmarks that have all the demands on one side and information about Red Stockings on the other. And
they are beautiful.
And we're thanks. And we will be in touch with you about the further stuff that we're doing, including neighborhood consciousness raising in New York.
So I'd love to take some questions for Jenny.
If you want to go first, you get extra special points in my book. That's a big leap. Just raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone.
Sorry, I came late, so if I'm repeating something that was already said, forgive me. I was wondering if you might reflect on going outside of the U.S. context a little bit, talk about the connection between nationalism and natalist policies, and sort of the flip side of the birth strike, perhaps, is a situation in which women are encouraged or even directed, mandated to reproduce for a certain political end, and also how this intersects with increasing xenophobia. Particularly in some Central Europe and some of the so-called Visegrad nations, talking about adopting more pro-natalist policies in order to, as kind of a little bit of an offshoot of sort of this replacement theory informed ideology around wanting to increase population.
Yeah, so you see it very much in Turkey. There's this worry that the Kurdish birth rate is higher than the than the ethnic Turkish birth rate, and it takes the form of a lot of encouragement, of sort of rhetorical encouragement from the top of women to have kids, and also attempts to crack down on abortion and birth control, which in Turkey have been fairly unsuccessful because feminists just really fought back hard. The other thing that you notice in Turkey is that none of this has made any difference to the birth rate. It's continued to decline. And that is true really throughout Eastern Europe. The birth rate continues to decline, and all of this exhortation from the top, including in Russia, there's a lot of exhortation from the top. Now, Russia is much more putting in programs that make it easier to have kids than they are. But there's a lot of rhetoric about we have to have more kids, and it's very much, in Germany, it's been. I think the remarkable thing about it is that it's been utterly unsuccessful in raising the birth rate. What's successful in raising the birth rate is when they actually provide more services, or especially childcare.
Yeah, in Germany, the school day ends at lunchtime. I mean, they can natter on about white supremacy all they want. But
yes,
that's
and
really
women are not willing to do it. Yeah. But we don't have to go overseas to hear, white supremacy promotions of the higher birth rate, right? Steve King, the Iowa congressman, his tweets sound like stuff from the 1870s in the U.S. We can't rebuild America on someone else's babies, this kind of thing. And you hear, Trump moaning that there aren't more immigrants from Norway. I can tell you.
The whole sort of family separate. I mean, just the brutality.
Yeah.
Punishing people for bringing children into this country.
Yeah, and it's quite clear and very explicit. I recommend if you want to get into this stuff, reading this book by Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida, called Immigration Wars. He lays it out. They don't want these family reunification things. Look, family reunification, who are these people? They're these kids, they're these parents, they're old, they're not contributing anything. What we really want is just the worker. And so this means that what they want is guest worker programs, euphemistically called guest worker programs, where you can deport the worker as soon as the either as soon as the economy changes, so you don't have people unemployed protesting, or just because they didn't work hard enough, or they wanted to start a union, or they objected in some way. So this is a dream for employers, to have workers who are completely bound around with these restrictions. And in terms of Jeb Bush is also also very worried about. He's very worried that the birth rate is dropping in Mexico. I mean, they have essentially relied on immigration to make up the difference. It won't work with a 1.76 birth rate. You would need 5 times the immigration we've got now. So it's not really working. But they're very explicit about wanting workers to come in and then being able to boot them out as immediately. So
a real crisis at the border is not enough people coming across the border?
Well, I mean, remember that, they want immigrants, but they don't want those immigrants to have rights.
Right. So they want to make
and
it
there
as
is, I mean, there is
possible.
Definitely an anti-immigrant faction within the ruling class. It appears to me that it's about 15 or 20%. And then the other faction is mad at them for not wanting immigrants for cultural reasons. So there is a split, but in general, employers in the ruling class are very happy to have immigrants, but that they don't want immigrants with rights. So that means you get all these crackdowns and raids and everything, which puts immigrants in a much more powerless position, and as employees much more.
Right.
Client, right? Because they are completely dependent on employment to survive. So yeah, I mean the whole immigration situation is I think it's very clearly an effort to crack down on the working population of the U.S. and just undermine all of our working conditions by essentially making sure working people have no power, whether they're immigrants or native born.
Any other questions?
Hi, could you talk about if there are differences within the ruling class on these issues, not just immigration, but in general, abortion, birth control, et cetera, and if there are Democrat, Republican, and what you're seeing within the ruling class on this?
Yeah, I mean, my impression. So the panic about the lower birth rate does extend into liberal think tanks, but they have maybe a slightly different prescription. So this guy at National Defense University is saying, well, we need a higher birth rate to fill the military and all this stuff, but the way to do that is to have childcare. So so there are, and then there's sort of the other side where, yeah, they're explicitly against. There's this faction called the Reformicons, who are conservatives but reformers supposedly, and they occasionally burst out with some suggestion like, a small baby bonus or 8 weeks of maternity leave. You can. Mike Lee is one of them, the guy who just urged us all to get married and have babies, Senator Mike Lee. So they're not sure. There are some that want to bring in social programs, but not very much, and not too expensive, and just a little bit. And then I do think that the Democrats are much more likely to just think we can solve this by immigration. And the Republicans are much more likely to say we can solve this by banning abortion. I would say that's sort of
those are the two
tendencies, right?
Well, one is definitely a lot better than the other. But yeah.
Take maybe one last question.
Hi. I'm one of those 1968 Gainesville Women's Liberation.
Right on.
There's a blurb in your book by Stephanie Luce, professor of labor studies, and she says, this book illuminates how women's liberation is in fundamental conflict with capitalism. All right, so women are needed by the 1%, the capitalist class, whatever, to produce the surplus labor producers and to produce soldiers to defend capitalist ill-gotten gains, right? Our free labor in childbearing and rearing is sort of, they have to have it, But so I guess my question is, Sylvia Federici says wages for housework. There's all kinds of good. I mean, we have a way of talking about it, unfair labor conditions, Are we in fundamental, is women's liberation in fundamental conflict? I don't know the answer to this question. I think it is. But couldn't they just give us good programs like in Norway and pay us and let us get Social Security when we have kids and do all that, and then we'd have kids, and capitalism could go peacefully on exploiting and wrecking everybody's life? Or is there a fundamental conflict?
That's a great question.
So worldwide, the birth rate is dropping in nearly every country. The only, and because of the age structure of the population, I believe Africa is the only continent where the population is actually continuing to grow. I don't think capitalism has dealt with this ever before. I think this is going to be a new thing. So, I mean, they can always create new markets by, flattening a country with bombs and then trying to, right? But the question is, like, if women really had full reproductive rights and had utter control, and decided we want a gently declining population. Capitalism demands growth. Could it handle that? I think it remains to be seen. I think it's a new situation and we should be watching it. But I do think that there is a question, like, can they really give us full reproductive rights and continue to operate the way they have been?
Tell them that they can.
Yes, yeah, I think that seems like a good move. I must say that was one of the many things that I loved about this book. Is it is very rare to read a book about capitalism in which the author says, this is a new thing that is happening and we don't know how it is going to play out. And I found that very very refreshing, that Jenny identifies a thing that we don't really understand fully yet. We can't really make predictions, and she says so. I think that's great.
And I should say that, abortion rights, even if we lose abortion rights, we now have pretty good technology for abortion. We have abortion pills.
Important.
And so if it's outlawed, it's very unlikely to actually raise the birth rate much, if, as long as we're organized and can make sure people have access to this. So it's going to be an interest. I mean, I really think that the reproductive rights fight is this frontline fight about who is going to do this labor, and that's why it's so intense right now. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny, and everyone
Thanks, Liza.
should